The body arrived at the funeral home just after midnight, wrapped in a white sheet, like so many others. But the moment Lucas Ferreira saw the pale face under the cold light, he knew this was no ordinary corpse. It was a message. There was no blood, no apparent violence, just the dry silence of death, and a name on the form that made his stomach churn. Lucas Ferreira. His gloves felt stuck to his skin, his mind spinning. How was that name here? Why now? Why with him? There were things even the dead couldn't hide. And this body carried more than old memories. It carried a past he didn't even know belonged to him. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, comment where you're watching from, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and give us a like. Because what you're about to hear, isn't just a story, it's a warning. Take a deep breath. 7 days earlier, Lucas still thought he was just trying to survive. 25 years old, an undocumented immigrant in the United States, abandoned by his own future. He worked the shifts nobody wanted, in the places the living avoided. He woke up among coffins and slept behind the embalming room. He lived in hiding. He was from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. He crossed the border with coyotes, fleeing debt and trying to save the only thing that still made sense. His mother. She had advanced Alzheimer's and lived alone with a neighbor's help. With every call he received, Lucas lost a piece of the little bond they had left. The last time, she called him Sir. She didn't recognize her own voice. He had dreamed of being a doctor. He had been studying before he fled. But dreams die fast. When you don't have papers and you're surrounded by... It was on a rainy night, smelling of mildew, his hands still shaking from the last embalming, that Vivian Marlowe appeared. Lucas was at the small, empty coffee shop he always went to after his shift, where the food was cheap and silence was the rule. But that night, the silence had eyes. Vivian watched him from a distance. She seemed too out of place to be there. An expensive gray coat, a rigid posture, and a gaze that didn't shift even out of politeness. When she approached, she didn't smile. She didn't ask to sit. She just did. She knew his name. She knew his mother's name. She knew he lived in the back of the funeral home. She knew the hospital in Ciudad Juarez. She knew his father's name. And what she said next wasn't a request. It was a sentence. She wanted to marry him. Lucas thought it was crazy. But Vivian spoke like someone who didn't need to convince anyone. She spoke with the coldness of someone who had already decided everything before opening her mouth. According to her, it wasn't love. It was restitution. Her brother, Jonathan, had lost everything because of an old scandal involving Lucas's father, an accountant who, until then, the son believed had died an honest man. But in Vivian's version, he had been responsible for destroying contracts, bankrupting community clinics, and ruining Jonathan's life, who committed suicide months later. She wanted his son. She wanted Lucas. As a symbol, as a calculated blow, as a closed cycle. In exchange, she offered the impossible: money, documents, stability, complete treatment for his mother, and silence. A lot of silence. Lucas hesitated, but the hesitation lasted until the next morning's phone call. Mrs. Dolores reported that his mother had tried to leave the house without clothes. She couldn't remember how to open the fridge. She couldn't remember she had a son. The wedding happened 7 days later. No music, no real witnesses, just pens, papers, and a judge who asked no questions. Leaving the registry office, it was raining. Vivian looked at Lucas and said the debt was settled not with the past, but with destiny. The Marlowe mansion was colder than the night. Long corridors, high windows that never opened, old carpets that muffled footsteps as if the house didn't want anyone to hear anything. The butler, Raymond, looked like a specter from another century. He greeted Lucas with a dry gaze, a gaze that said everything and nothing. In the bedroom, the sheets smelled of lavender and old wood. The bed was too big for someone who lived hunched over. The walls seemed to whisper. On that first night, Lucas heard laughter, childlike laughter, faint, distant. But in the morning, when he mentioned it to Raymond, the man just said that in this house only the living dwelled, and not all of them willingly. In the following days, notes began to appear, perfectly folded, elegant handwriting, sentences like blades. Everything has a price. Yours was too cheap. He tried to run to... You don't understand yet. but you will. He didn't know who was writing them, but he knew they were for him, and that someone was enjoying themselves. In the basement, he found a box. Inside, charred photos. Some still revealed smiles. Lucas's father, next to Vivian, and a young man who could only be Jonathan, all well-dressed, friends, partners. In the next photo, everything had changed. The facade of a closed clinic, broken glass, graffiti in Red Dream Thieves. Vivian one day gave him a dark ring. She said it was her brother's. Inside, the inscription read, "He who deceives by light dies in darkness." And then, before the night the body arrived at the funeral home, before everything started to fall apart, Lucas received the last note. "You are just the beginning. Others will come." The Marlowe mansion was on the outskirts of Pasadena, far enough away that no one would hear anything, even if someone screamed. It was surrounded by high walls and ivy that climbed like claws over the old stones. The gates opened with a heavy creak when Lucas arrived, dressed in the custom-made suit Vivian had ordered. No carpa said no soul was seen in the vicinity. It was as if this place was isolated from the world or outside of it. The taxi couldn't enter. The driver just nodded and left in silence. At the door, Raymond awaited him with a black umbrella and an expression that shifted between neutrality and weariness. The man was older than he looked. His white hair was cut short, his posture too erect to be natural, and his eyes seemed burdened with history, but a history no one wanted to tell. He led Lucas to the main hall, where Vivian awaited them with a glass of wine in her hand and a slight smile on her face. She said nothing for a few seconds. She just watched him, like someone evaluating a sculpture. Then she nodded to Raymond, who disappeared as silently as he had appeared. Vivian pointed to the top of the stairs and said his room was at the end of the hall, that he would have everything he needed there. But then she added, without changing her tone of voice, "Everything, except questions." Lucas didn't answer, but it sounded more like a command than a warning. The room was impeccable. Linen sheets, antique lamps, furniture that looked like it was from a museum auction. There was a decorative fireplace, a brown leather armchair, and a small desk with stationery and a fountain pen. But there were no mirrors. None, not even in the bathroom, as if the room had been arranged for someone who didn't need to remember his own face. That night, Lucas tried to sleep, but the mattress seemed to sink beneath him, and the absolute silence of the house was interrupted only by sporadic creaks in the ceiling, like soft footsteps walking in the middle of the night. It was 3 a.m. when he heard the laughter again, faint, childlike, coming from the corridor. He slowly got up, opened the door, and looked out. Nothing, but on the floor of the corridor, a few feet away, were a pair of small, wet, barefoot footprints, and they vanished before reaching the bend. At breakfast, Vivian appeared as if she had woken up before the sun. She wore a dark blue silk robe and discreet diamond earrings. She looked rested, but there was something in her eyes, a dry, restless glint. She casually commented that the house was big, and he would soon get used to the sounds. She said that some things remain even, when they should have gone away. Lucas tried to ask about his father. He wanted to understand how that man, who had always tried so hard, could have been involved in the destruction of an entire family. Vivian listened to him in silence, and then replied with a sentence he didn't forget. "There are 2 types of lies, the one we tell and the one we inherit." That answered nothing, but it made one thing clear. She knew more than she was willing to reveal. In the library, Lucas began to explore the books. Many were not just literature. There were files, old medical reports, scientific journals dated decades ago, some with notes in the margins. In one of them, he found an envelope sealed with black wax. "To seal bore an M" embossed on it. Inside, a letter, but when he tried to read it, he could only decipher a part. The words were faded, wet, as if someone had cried over them or tried to erase them in a hurry. The only legible lines said, ... It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Jonathan never forgave, but he knew your father didn't do it alone. ... Someone bigger. Someone from within. Lucas put the envelope back, his heart racing. A partially closed loop. Vivian wanted to punish Lucas's father, but now it seemed others were involved in Jonathan's collapse. Bigger people, and maybe, just maybe, Lucas's father had been more of a pawn than the instigator. The next night, Lucas found another note. This time, it was left on his desk, folded in 3. The handwriting was still firm, but now it was more direct. You are walking the same corridors he walked. He also wanted to leave, but he found out too late that the contract had already been signed. There was no signature, but the paper smelled of lavender, the same perfume Vivian wore. On the 3rd morning, Raymond appeared with a gift, a box lined with dark velvet. He said it was a welcome gesture from Mrs. Marlowe. Inside was the ring, the same one Jonathan used, an antique silver ring with an inscription engraved on the inside. He who deceives by light dies in darkness. Lucas felt the cold metal touch his skin and had the sensation that the phrase was already part of the house, that the walls knew. Raymond just watched, motionless, and, as he left, he let slip an almost inaudible sentence. Some names carry curses, but people usually call them inheritances. At the end of the week, Lucas began to notice patterns. The notes, te lafta, the ring, Vivian's silence when he asked about the past. But what bothered him most was the covered painting in the 2nd-floor corridor, always locked, always dusty, but never forgotten. One night, he saw Raymond standing in front of it, just standing, like someone guarding a tomb. And when Lucas approached, the butler simply walked away, without saying a word. The next morning, Lucas decided to go down to the basement again, this time more calmly. Searching, it was there that he found the photograph. Not the burned one, not the graffitied one, a new one, intact, hidden inside an old book on forensic medicine. In the image, Jonathan was smiling, young, in a white lab coat, in front of a brand new clinic. Next to him, unexpectedly, was Lucas's father, also in a lab coat, an arm over Jonathan's shoulder, like brothers, like allies. And between them, a 3rd figure, someone Lucas didn't recognize, an older man, gray hair, light tie, a forced smile. Behind them, on the clinic's sign, read Marlowe Institute for Genetic Research, Unit 3. That night, Lucas had a strange dream. He was walking through the corridors of the house, but everything was inverted. The walls bled, the paintings screamed, and when he arrived in front of Vivian's bedroom door, he found it open. Inside, there was a bathtub, full, and Vivian was there, submerged, her eyes open, smiling underwater. He woke up, sweating. But something even stranger happened when he got up. There were watermarks on the floor, wet, real, as if someone or something had been there. The next day, Jonathan Marlowe reappeared, this time as a body, in the morgue, where it all began. And Lucas realized that what he was living wasn't just revenge. It was a reconstruction, a repetition, as if someone were reenacting the past, using him as a central piece. Jonathan Marlowe, Vivian's dead brother, reappeared as a body on the cold table of the funeral home where Lucas worked. The name on the record, the date, the face, everything indicated he had died years ago. And yet, there he was, intact, returned. Lucas stared at the corpse, as one stares at a warning, because it wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't an administrative error. Someone had placed Jonathan there, at the right time, in the right place, in front of the only person who couldn't pretend nothing was happening. And in that instant, Lucas knew he was no longer a guest in that house. He was a prisoner in a plan that began long before he was born. The next morning, the light coming through the mansion's windows seemed different, colder, more calculated. Lucas woke up before 7, not because he was a light sleeper, but because he couldn't sleep. He spent the night tossing and turning, trying to understand how Jonathan, man he knew only as a story told by Vivian, had ended up on the stainless steel table where he prepared anonymous bodies. It was too much of a coincidence. It was too much precision. And the mansion seemed to know it. When he went down for breakfast, Raymond was already waiting. As always, the table was perfectly set, fruit cut into exact angles, napkins folded like flowers, a silver teapot gleaming even in the dim light. Vivian wasn't there. Lucas sat, but didn't touch anything. He was hungry. Yes, but the doubt burned more than his empty stomach. He looked at Raymond and asked what everyone in the house seemed to know but pretended not to see. "Jonathan is dead, right?" The butler didn't answer. He just walked away, as if the question had been addressed to the floor itself. In the library, Lucas spent hours searching through files. He wasn't looking for objective answers. He was looking for signs, indications that none of this was a breakdown or imagination. He found old medical notebooks, a diary with torn-out pages, and a folder with documents from an institution called MGN Labs, with Jonathan's name at the top. It was a genetic research company, based in California, founded by a group of doctors including, to his surprise, Lucas's father. His blood ran cold. Why had he never known about this? Why, his entire childhood, had his father always said he was just a simple accountant. His name was listed as external consultant, but next to it, scrawled in another hand, someone had written a sentence. He was the one who lit the fuse. Later, Raymond handed Lucas an envelope with no return address. Inside, there was a photo, a grainy image. Surveillance, perhaps. In it, Lucas was seen talking to Vivian for the first time, in that grimy coffee shop where it all began. The date on it was 2 days before the meeting had actually happened. In the following days, Lucas began to notice more distortions. Small details that seemed out of place but that only someone living in a house noticed. A painting that had been covered was now exposed. It showed a family of 3, a young Vivian, a smiling Jonathan, and a child whose face was completely erased. A cabinet that was locked one moment and ajar the next. Music that played from somewhere in the house in the dead of night, like a music box hidden within the walls. And more notes. Now, with a more urgent tone, "You are walking in his tracks." She lied about almost everything. Death was not the end. It was the trigger. If you don't leave, ... she will continue. One night, Lucas followed a sound. It was low, metallic, like a chain being dragged. It led him to the attic. There, among boxes covered in sheets and old furniture, he found a kind of Inside were objects wrapped in velvet. An old stethoscope, a badge from the Marlowe Institute, and a vial with what looked like dried blood. On the label, the name, Jonathan Marlowe. Experimental extraction, code 51A. This didn't make sense. Jonathan was a doctor. Why were his own blood samples stored here? And, more importantly, why would someone have hidden this at the highest point of the house? Returning to his room, he found Vivian sitting in his armchair. She didn't say how she got in, or why. She just commented, in a voice that was too soft, "The house has its own ways of communicating." Lucas tried to ask about the photo, about the genetic research, about Jonathan's body, but she interrupted him before he could finish. She said his father knew exactly what he was getting into, and that Lucas also knew, even if he hadn't accepted it yet. Before leaving, she left a question hanging in the air. "Do you really think you were the first to receive this offer?" And then she was gone, like a ghost who knows it's better to leave doubts than answers. The next morning, Lucas went down to the garden. It was the first time he had left the house since moving in. Among the sculpted trees and dry fountains, he found a locked greenhouse. The glass was frosted, but inside he could see the shadow of a wheelchair, and in it, someone sitting. "Motionless," he called out. Nothing. The shadow didn't move, but on the glass, someone had written with their fingers, "You've been here before." That night, Lucas dreamed of his father, but not as he remembered him. In the dream, he wore a lab coat, held a syringe, and said only one sentence before disappearing. "She is starting over, and you are the last piece that was missing." Lucas woke up with a tight chest and sweat-soaked sheets. On the nightstand, where he had left the ring, there was now something else. A key, small, silver, with the number 3C engraved on Italiano, and the certainty that the prison he was in still had many floors below. Lucas stared at the key, as one stares at a threat disguised as an answer. It was on the nightstand. It shone under the pale morning light, as if it had just been left there. It was small, made of aged silver, and at the top, engraved by hand, a number he had never seen in the house. 3C. There was no floor or wing of the house identified in this way. No numbered doors. No labels. Nothing. During breakfast, he tried to act naturally. Raymond, as always, was waiting for him. Vivian, absent. The cutlery was aligned. The juice was served. The silence was sharp. Lucas tried to observe the butler's eyes, his gestures, looking for a trace, a crack. But Raymond remained a well-polished mirror. He returned only what Lucas projected. Later, while pretending to look for books in the library, Lucas tried the key on some of the mansion's old doors. Nothing. Some were locked. Others didn't even have locks. But when he went up to the second floor, he passed through a narrow corridor he had never noticed before. A different, smaller door, almost hidden by an old screen. No name, no number, just dark wood and an old, worn lock. He took a deep breath and inserted the key. The click sounded like a muffled gunshot. The 3C room was more of a dead archive than a living space. Dust, shelves, cabinets, all locked with fragile latches. Piles of bound papers, old photographs, files with names and dates. But what caught Lucas's eye was a side wall where four paintings were hung, all with the same style of frame, for portraits of young men, strangers, each with distinct features, but all seemed to be of a similar age, and the same empty gaze. Below each painting, plaques with names, 2 Latinos, 1 from Eastern Europe, an African American, and dates, all with intervals of 2 to 3 years between them. The last one, 5 years before Lucas's arrival. Lucas began to flip through the files. Some of the records were incomplete, but the pattern was clear. All the men had been brought in by Vivian, all with a history of vulnerability, illegal immigration, debts, fragile family ties, no legal support, and they had all disappeared after about 6 to 8 months of living in the house. The oldest file ended with a handwritten note, incompatible, adequate physique, but compromised emotional resistance. Project discontinued. The second, promising, approach. Iterations with V positive, but breach of trust, removal necessary. The third, incomplete tests, unstable bioethical patterns, inconclusive results. The fourth was empty, just the man's name, his age, and a signature in the lower corner, Vivian Marlowe. Lucas was so engrossed that he didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor. He only noticed the presence when he felt the warmth of someone's breath behind him. It was Raymond. The butler didn't seem surprised to find him there. He just looked at him for a few seconds, as if calculating something. Tinny spoke, for the first time with a different tone, low, grave, almost human. Now you understand why so many came, but only one remains. Lucas tried to ask what that meant, but Raymond just walked away, leaving the door open behind him. That night, Vivian appeared for dinner. The first time in days. She was more elegant than usual. A long black dress, a pearl necklace, her hair tied back. Her face was illuminated, her eyes sharp. During dinner, she mentioned Lucas's mother's health in detail. She spoke of a new hospitalization in Juarez, which he hadn't even known about. She said she had already arranged everything. Lucas felt his body go cold. She was still pulling the puppet strings, even from miles away. But then, between sips of wine, she said something that seemed like a break in her facade. Some names carry the guilt, others carry the function. And you, Lucas, ... you carry both. Later, he returned to room 3C. One of the paintings was on the floor. The glass was broken, and the portrait had disappeared. In its place, just a piece of paper taped to the wall. You are closer than any of them ever got. At the end of the night, Lucas tried to leave the house. Enidet perspective. But when he got to the electronic gate, the remote didn't work. He tried to climb electric fences. He tried to call out to someone in the street. No one passed by. He tried to call his mother's hospital. The call dropped before it could connect, and it was at that moment he realized the house wasn't just an emotional prison. It was literal, and he still hadn't seen the entire basement. Lucas spent the night wide awake. The missing portrait, the enigmatic note, the clinical files of other men like him, everything collided like pieces of a puzzle, too distorted to make sense. But something told him time was running out. At 3:14 a.m., he heard the sound of metal dragging on the floor. It came from under the house, an irregular echo, as if something heavy were being pulled by hooks. He went down. He passed through the dark kitchen, then the pantry, until he found a door he had never noticed before. It had an old, rusty latch. When he pushed it open, the air that came out was colder than the night itself. The basement wasn't like the rest of the house. There was no luxury, no frames, no light. There was concrete. There was the smell of copper. There were corridors with numbered steel doors, and a staircase that went down ... Even further, the third level was different. The walls had old digital panels. There were marks of equipment removed in a hurry, as if someone had emptied a lab in a rush to escape. But what made him stop was a sign on the wall, covered by a torn tarp. MGEN Labs, Advanced Studies Unit Level 3 Restricted Access. On the floor, damp folders and black and white photos. In one of Tim, Jonathan appeared seated, with electrodes on his chest, looking intently at the camera. Behind him, standing, was Lucas's father, smiling, in a lab coat. Lucas felt his legs go weak. But there was more. On a steel shelf, there were small vials, with labels, blood, tissues, samples, all dated, all catalogued with numbers. One of the vials, however, stood out. It had his name on it, Lucas Ferreira. Date, just 11 days ago. He never authorized anything. He never donated blood. He was never tested, or was he? What else were they collecting from him? Behind the shelf, a plastic curtain hid a second room. Lucas pushed it aside. What he saw paralyzed him. It was an examination room with a single central gurney. On the ceiling, a camera. On the walls, old monitors. In the corner, a cabinet with syringes, tubes, and a medical refrigerator that was still on. And on the floor, covered by a transparent tarp, a body. Lucas approached, trembling. It was a man. He looked young, but worn out. Pale skin, marks on his wrists, eyes closed. For a second, he thought it was one of the previous ones. But when he looked at the badge hanging around his neck, the world seemed to crumble under his feet. Jonathan Merlot. The image was clear. The same face he had prepared in the morgue, the same man who had died years ago, the same body that had been buried. Or had it? The badge was clean, the hair damp, and his chest ... It moved, a millimeter, almost imperceptible, but real. The man was breathing. Lucas stumbled out of the room, his heart pounding, his thoughts jumbled. Vivian had said she wanted justice. But this wasn't justice. It was an experiment, a cycle, a curse repeated with new test subjects. And now he was part of it. On the way back up the stairs, almost at the surface, Lucas found Raymond. This time, the butler said nothing. He just watched, as if he knew that from then on, Lucas was no longer innocent. He could no longer leave. He could no longer go back. The game had truly begun, and the body in the basement ... was just the first piece. Waking up, the next morning, Lucas woke up with blood on his hand. He didn't know how, or whose, but on his bed was a new note. He opened his eyes at night and called for you. You have the same blood and the same function. Now, he also wants answers. Lucas looked at the window. The gate was still locked. The phone line was still dead, and the house ... was no longer silent. Lucas spent the morning trying to figure out if he was really awake. The note on his bed said Jonathan had opened his eyes and called for it. The words were written in the same elegant handwriting as the previous notes. Only now ... They weren't metaphors. He remembered the body, the wires, the breathing. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. He had found Jonathan alive, even after having Sinan touch the corpse. And now, someone wanted him to know. In the bathroom, the faucet was dripping blood. When he turned the water on, the liquid returned to normal. But on the sides of the sink, there were still dark splatters, as if someone or something had washed their hands there in the middle of the night. Lucas looked at his own fingers. A slight cut on his thumb. A scratch he didn't remember getting. During breakfast, Raymond acted normally. He served the tea, adjusted the napkin, collected the flowers from the center of the table as if it were part of a daily ritual. But Lucas noticed the detail. The cup Raymond brought for him wasn't the usual one. It had the name L engraved on the porcelain, the initials of Lucas's father. Vivian appeared later that day. She called Lucas to the greenhouse, only place in the house that still seemed alive. Tropical plants, some exotic flowers. the smell of wet soil. She said he looked tired. She said the house could be suffocating at first. And then, with a voice as sweet as dissolved poison, she said that most of the men who lived there before him didn't last long. Say side that? The mind collapses before the body? Lucas tried to ask about Jonathan. Vivian smiled and answered with another question. Do you think death is the most reliable ending? That night, Lucas returned to the basement. He went down with the key hidden in his pocket and an emergency flashlight. But when he got to the room where he had found Jonathan ... it was empty. The gurney, the equipment, the body, everything was gone. All that remained was a strong smell of ether and a new note, taped to the wall with a syringe stuck through the paper. You saw him. Now he has seen you too. He knows you have what's missing. And she has known that for a long time. Leaving the lab, Lucas noticed something strange on the stairs. There were claw marks on the walls, 4 parallel lines, as if something had climbed up there, tearing at the concrete. At the top of the stairs, near the kitchen door, one of the light fixtures was broken, and on the floor, a glass vial with the name Protocol RA, second generation, Lucas Ferreira later. Hidden in the library, Lucas found a cabinet that had always been locked. The 3C key now worked there too. Inside were dozens of folders with the MGEN Labs seal. Most contained clinical exams, neurological reports, brain scans, and graphs. But among them, a different folder, marked Level 5, Confidential. Opening 8. Lucas read something that paralyzed him. The inherited genetic code of LF father carries latent but mutable instability. The union with Marlowe bloodlines would generate the necessary component for the activation of Project RA. Jonathan was the first. Lucas is the last. He didn't know what activation meant, or what Project RA really was. But he now knew 2 things for sure. Jonathan didn't die because of his father. He died or was killed because of what he carried in his blood. Lucas was the next stage of this experiment. Or maybe, ... the final stage. The next morning, Lucas went to the garden. He needed to breathe. He needed to run. But as he rounded the side of the house, he found a figure with its back to him, kneeling in front of the broken greenhouse. He wore white clothes. His hair was brown. Call it out. The figure slowly turned. It was Jonathan, with his eyes open, but no light in them. And his skin was starting to look more like someone who shouldn't be standing. Jonathan was kneeling in front of the broken greenhouse, his face lowered, his hands clasped as if he were praying or trying to remember how. Lucas froze. Jonathan slowly turned. His eyes were open, yes, but there was no life in them. Not as Lucas knew it. It was like looking at someone who was switched off inside. His skin had a grayish tone. There were needle marks on his neck, and when he tried to speak ... no sound came out. Just a dry noise, like air scraping glass. Lucas backed away. Jonathan took 1 step forward, then another. But then ... he stopped, as if he hit an invisible boundary. On dead ground, Lucas noticed circular marks made with white chalk surrounding the greenhouse, as if it were a ritualistic barrier. Vivian already knew he would return, and she knew he needed to be contained. Later, Lucas returned to the library, locked the door, and opened the confidential folder again. At the bottom, a flash drive was taped with electrical tape. He went up to his room, used the old laptop he kept hidden, and opened the files. What he saw changed everything. Videos, old recordings, some with the MGen Labs logo, others without any identification. In them, Jonathan appeared in exams, memory tests, resistance tests, tests with pain stimuli. The doctors with blurred faces mentioned Project RA frequently. They called it autonomous reconstruction. Genetic application on subjects with traits of impulsivity, loyalty, and cross-memory. The objective, to transfer not only biological patterns, but inherited personality traits. Project RA wasn't just about DNA. It was about identity transfer, a type of memory cloning based on family genetics. And Jonathan ... had been the first test subject. The experiment failed. He had a mental collapse. He committed suicide or was induced to. But Vivian didn't give up. She didn't just want to continue her brother. She wanted to remake him. And Lucas, by carrying the compatible blood, was the final piece. At the end of the last video, a voice says, "The new generation requires a direct link to the matrix. If the organism is compatible, the transfer can be total. But it must be done before neurological instability." The window is short. Lucas understood. Vivian didn't want revenge. She wanted to revive Jonathan, but to do that, Lucas would have to die. That night, he planned to escape. He tried to get out through the garden. He cut the fence with an old pair of pliers. He jumped the back wall, but, upon falling on the other side, he came face to face with Raymond. Alone, motionless, as if he already knew. Lucas ran, but the butler didn't chase him. He just said, from a distance, "The house returns what it chooses to keep." Lucas spent the night hiding in the deactivated chapel at the back of the mansion. The place was small, with benches covered in dust, and a stone altar. On the floor, old inscriptions. He found a notebook there, pages written by hand, by the handwriting, Jonathan's, fragment, thoughts, visions. "She says it's for my own good, but forces me to forget who I am. Every time I wake up, I don't remember the day before. She wants to rebuild me, but doesn't know she broke me first. If I don't escape, Yope can." On the last page, there was a crude drawing, a face. It was Lucas's face. Below it, a sentence. "He will try to save me, but maybe I don't deserve to be saved." Lucas returned to the house before dawn. He knew Vivian was awake. He knew Raymond was watching. And he knew Jonathan was still waiting for him somewhere, between life and what was left of it. As he entered the hall, he found Vivian sitting at the piano. She was playing something soft, hypnotic. Without turning around, she said, "You finally understood, didn't you?" Lucas clenched his fists and answered, for the first time without fear, "I am not him." Vivian smiled. "Not yet, but you will be. Or ... no one else will." The sound of the piano echoed through the house like a drawn-out lament. Vivian played with a firm hand. The melody was too soft to match the tension in the air and, for that very reason, terrifying, like a lullaby used to anesthetize the conscience. Lucas stood in the doorway. She knew he had discovered everything, and she didn't seem surprised or worried. Vivian Marlowe was not the type to lose control. She was the type to write the endings before the beginnings. "I am not him," Lucas repeated, now more quietly. Vivian didn't stop playing, but she answered calmly, "And yet, you reacted like him. You investigated. You were suspicious. You tried to run away." Her gaze was almost affectionate, like someone observing a rare piece being tested. "That just confirms what the tests showed, Lucas. You are the ideal successor." He took a deep breath, but his chest hurt. It wasn't just fear, it was doubt. What if everything he was feeling wasn't just his anymore? That morning, Raymond called him for a talk. He took him to the basement, but through another entrance a hidden elevator behind a false bookshelf in the game room. The elevator went even deeper. There, Lucas saw the last wing of the project, a glass corridor, containment rooms, equipment that looked like it was from an abandoned psychiatric hospital, and in the last room, Jonathan. But now, he was awake, sitting, eyes open, looking directly at Lucas, but without recognizing him. Raymond didn't explain much. He just said, the first attempts were ... aggressive. The body resisted. The brain erased memories to protect itself. Jonathan lost himself. But the cells, they ... continue to function. Lucas felt a knot in his stomach. Jonathan was there, but he wasn't himself anymore. He spoke disjointed phrases, repeated numbers, sang snippets of children's songs. And when he saw Lucas for the third time, he said something, "You ... have the light she extinguished in me." That night, Vivian explained everything, without filters, without beating around the bush. Project Aaron had been started to preserve brilliant minds that the body couldn't sustain, an attempt to imprint consciousness and identity onto compatible genetic bloodlines. Jonathan was the first attempt. His body held up, but his mind ... broke. Lucas's father was the scientist responsible for the transfer codes. Jonathan and he worked together, but diverged especially when they saw that the process required a biological anchor, a pure, healthy, and psychologically resilient blood relative. Vivian pointed to Lucas. "You are that anchor, the link that closes the chain." She wanted to reactivate the project, not for money, not for power, but because she couldn't bear to live without her brother. Lucas screamed. He said she couldn't. He said she couldn't, that he wasn't a test subject, that he wasn't an extension of anyone. Vivian then approached. She held his face with a monstrous calm. "You are not just you, Lucas. You never were." Vivian doesn't want to avenge Jonathan. She wants to bring him back whole. And to do that, she needs to take Lucas's identity and transfer it to what's left of her brother. Lucas went back to his room with a plan in his mind. He rummaged through the old Emgen Labs folder, took the flash drive, the tapes, the evidence. He wrote a quick letter, addressed to Mrs. Dolores in Juarez, along with everything. He sealed it in an envelope, put it in his bag, and waited for the middle of the night. At 2:43 a.m., he left, silent, through the back of the garden. He had memorized the camera's blind spots. He knew the night guard's patrol time, and he had kept the spare gate key that Raymond had dropped weeks earlier. Or that ... he had dropped on purpose. But as he opened the gate, something went wrong. A silent alarm, light beams activated, and from the top of the staircase, Vivian appeared, in silence, with a remote in her hand, and behind her, Jonathan, walking, breathing. His face was empty, but his eyes were Lucas's. For an instant, Lucas didn't recognize himself, because he was there, duplicated, rewritten. Vivian pressed the button, and the lights in the house went out all at once. Everything plunged into darkness, and Lucas ran. But inside, someone was already running after him. The next morning, the house was surrounded. But by whom? No one could say. What happened inside, in the last 12 hours, was never clearly reported. All that is known is that only one person walked out, but no one is quite sure. Who it was. The man who came out had Lucas's face, but his eyes were someone else's. Lucas ran. The darkness of the mansion swallowed him like a hungry labyrinth. Each step echoed louder than the last. The air felt denser. The floor vibrated. And, behind him, the footsteps didn't stop. They weren't fast, but they were constant. Like someone who didn't need to run to catch up. He crossed the hall, went up the steps of the west wing, tried to lock one of the doors, tried to use furniture to block the entrance. But it was too late. When he turned around, Jonathan was there, or what was left of him. His skin was deformed by the reprogramming. His eyes, still alive. But without a name, without direction, without a soul. Lucas hesitated. His body trembled. But what truly paralyzed him was when Jonathan spoke. "You, are the end." And then he smiled. Not a smile of happiness, but of release. As if the cycle was finally closed. As if he wanted to erase himself. The fight was short, but brutal. Shattered glass, torn paintings, blood on the walls. Vivian appeared at the end of the corridor, screaming something. But it was too late. Jonathan's strength was not human, but it was also not stable. He oscillated between lucidity and collapse. Lucas, on an impulse, used Jonathan's ring, the one with the inscription that had always bothered him. "He who deceives by light dies in darkness," and he plunged it into Jonathan's chest, right at the point where his heartbeat was almost non-existent. Jonathan failed. But, before he passed out, he whispered, "Thank you for not being like her." Vivian ran to him, tried to stop it, tried to bring him back. But what she was holding in her arms, was no longer her brother. And, maybe, it never had been. Lucas left the mansion before dawn. The sky was clear, for the first time in weeks. Behind him, the house was burning, slowly, silently, as if it had waited its whole life to die. And inside, the last vestiges of Project R had turned to smoke. They say the man who left the Marlowe property that morning, had Lucas Ferreira's face. But his eyes were different. Some swear he looked relieved, others that he looked possessed, and some simply didn't recognize him. but he knew who he was, or who he had decided to be. Months later, Vivian's estate was opened in court. The fortune, the files, the records. Lucas received a letter handwritten, delivered by a lawyer. The handwriting was "You were more than an experiment. You were the first variable that chose not to repeat itself. If you are reading this, it means I failed to beat you. But perhaps you have finally understood what Jonathan tried to tell me for so long. The past is a house we have to know how to let burn. Inside the envelope, a copy of the will. Vivian had left him everything. The house, the inheritance, the shares. But Lucas sold everything. With the money, he created something different. A fund. A project with a symbolic name. JM Foundation. Memories that are not repeated. The first scholarship was given to a young Mexican woman, the daughter of immigrants, who dreamed of studying biomedicine. Lucas, now with regularized documents, also went back to studying, this time, medicine as he had dreamed, before fleeing to survive. And whenever he is asked about the scar on his chest, he replies with something he learned too late. Sometimes, pain is not what we inherit. It's what we choose not to pass on. A year later, in a university library, he received a letter with no return address. Inside, only an old photograph. Jonathan, smiling, next to his father. Between them, a small child, hidden in the shadow. And on the back of the photo, a sentence, "Some names carry curses, but some, ... learn to re-baptize them." Lucas put the photo in his pocket, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that the cycle had ended. Not with destruction, but with choice. If you've made it this far, it's because, like Lucas, you wanted to understand the truth behind appearances. And if this story moved you, share it. Because maybe the only thing that truly saves itself is the memory we choose to keep alive.